I think emphasizing for everyone when you're writing that execute SQL call to think very carefully, do I need this to run PSOS for performance reasons, or is it okay to run it on the client side? It is a potential landmine that's not that easy to track down if you've got the use of execute SQL out there on the client side and it's super fast and then randomly drags to an absolute standstill a year from now. I like execute SQL a lot, but it puts a pretty decent burden on the developer to think about the long-term situation and make sure they do it in a way that makes sense. So we were going to talk about this morning a little bit about some of the problems we've run into from time to time at a few clients, especially lately in the last year or two of execute SQL. I was originally thinking in calculated fields. Jillian was bringing up the hidden objects issue, but places where execute SQL runs way more often than you might have anticipated when you wrote the function. And I'm sorry, Jillian, you were talking about that impact in that one client in the hidden object hiding functionality.
Yeah, I discovered after doing an AI audit that there are one of the reasons that the client system is so slow is hide calcs on layouts, objects on layouts. So that would be something that if we were going to do some work for them to help with performance, that might be something to kind of cull.
So where is it on a listing layout where the calc has to where the hide calculation has to run a whole bunch of times? Or
I didn't explore it too deeply for this particular client, but it seemed to me that anywhere that you're running a SQL to determine whether or not a field should hide doesn't seem like a good idea.
yeah, I think execute SQL has to, especially on the client side, execute SQL has to pull all the data over to the client side in order to perform the query. Um,
Only if there's uncommitted records.
right, sorry, only if there's uncommitted records, which so it depends on the database. So quite often it might have to pull all the data um, over to the client side to perform. So if you've got I guess even if it's a detail layout, if you've got an object being hidden by a execute SQL calculation, and that execute SQL calculation is querying a table that has 100,000 records in it, you've obviously got a massive performance hit. And if you've got 20 users and they're all hitting that layout periodically, and it has to perform that calculation all the time, um, that's a crazy performance hit. I think to the best of my knowledge, we've never used an execute SQL command in situations like that, or in calculated fields, which is the other thing we were going to talk about. Um, but we've inherited these couple of solutions in the last couple of years where other developers, I'm throwing unknown people under the bus here, um, have done that, and it has gargantuan performance implications in some cases.
In a couple of those solutions we've inherited, some of the issues aren't just inherently the SQL call itself, but the way they're written too, because FileMaker doesn't support true window functions in SQL. There's some subqueries happening where you basically have nested SQL calls. So you're getting the results from one SQL call to feed as a parameter to a secondary SQL call to calculate whatever that value is, right? And we have that on both unstored calcs as well as some hide conditions on individual layouts. And that's proved to be quite problematic with speed.
What we have found is that as the record count in the solution has gotten up, um, the server engine, the database engine, really with a relatively small number of users, 10 to 15 users, the database engine gets so backed up by all those SQL queries that it basically stops itself up and can't function really. It would be interesting to see under the hood if you could look really deeply at how many calls were stacked up in some of these cases. But it, it's it's been pretty interesting to see the impact of that in a real world situation.
I think another thing that could be useful to keep in mind is I've noticed that when using AI to help with writing field calculations, it sometimes uses SQL, executes SQL within those calculations. And so I tend to try to catch that because I don't want it to solve the problem using that in a calculated field.
Right.
The same
Yeah,
thing with, sure about while is while, can you use that in a calculated field? I had the AI suggest that today and I'm like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do it that way.
I think you can. I don't know if that's a good idea.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
I do use that pattern. I use while in place of where we used to use recursive functions.
But in a calculated field?
Uh, I've used it in auto enter calculated fields.
Okay. Yeah. I think anything in the hands of a knowledgeable developer can be okay. I mean, if you know for a fact that you're using Execute SQL to grab a preference value from a one record table, and you know by system design that that table's never going to have more than one record in it, and you know that the calculated field that you're defining, um, you just know because of the system design, it's never going to be a performance problem. Then you, as a knowledgeable developer, you know, it's up to you to make sure everything works. I think
And is
that
that, is just for my edification, is that less of a performance hit than, say, making sure you just always have a relationship to that preferences table? I mean, that, do you know what I mean? Like if you say you have a logo and you want the logo to appear on every layout, do you build in all the relationships to make sure your tables can access that preferences table? Or do you use your suggestion where you have a field that does a SQL call to the preference table rather than having the relationships?
I
good
think
question.
in a simpler relation like that, it can be either. I would tend to relate the table to it and not use SQL. I think where the performance hits are really going to come in is with joins that are more than one table deep, like you're trying to grab something from two or three tables away. That's when SQL can really shine. Or if the joins are really complicated, if you're doing a multi-predicate join for something, that seems to evaluate a little bit slower than SQL would do for the same thing. Plus record counts. SQL's evaluating that entire table, and that can slow things down substantially.
I concur.
Again, only if there's uncommitted records, that does make a huge difference.
Well,
Um, there's some tables that I'll query that I know are like I might have 50,000 records in it, but new ones are created rarely. You know, it might be like a final step in a big process. So trying to query that is usually pretty safe and usually faster than trying to, pull data out of there via relationships.
Hmm.
to what Nick's saying, I will tend to steer clear of using Execute SQL if it's a user-facing data tables, where I can find myself in a situation where those records might be locked. But will instead, use Execute SQL for preference or settings tables
Yeah.
to query, like you said, to pull a stored value out of there.
It's also a consideration to use PSOS. If I mean, we're getting off topic a tiny bit, but if you're using execute SQL in a script, and you're concerned about uncommitted records and the loading of all that data over to the client side, if you run the script PSOS, then you're getting server-side performance regardless, and it doesn't matter if there's uncommitted records in the found set or in the table. So I know in a variety of solutions we've done that. We've done that approach, run all the execute SQLs by a PSOS, and that helps a lot. But the problem with the field calculations, the execute SQL and the field calculations is that there's just no control. Everything, FileMaker's recalculating those results all the time with very little to no control on your part as the developer. And so if you've got a bunch of data entry going on, like this one solution that we're refactoring right now, you've got a 10 people doing data entry. Every record created is forcing these execute SQL field definitions to be executed. And there's a million records in the table. And even though those calculations are evaluating server side, the churn on the database engine is just it gets beyond FileMaker. And this is a fast M4 Mac Studio server that this client's using. And yet the database engine cannot keep up with the field calculation churn.
Yeah, to that point, in our experience, it has been hardware agnostic. We've had this exact solution on several different servers of different capacities and had the same issue.
Yeah,
Just to be clear, when those SQL queries do occur, do they occur in the background silently, or do they only run at the time that they are being called or faced to the user? Do we know that they're running silently, without actually being called in a script or on a layout? Do we know that for certain?
If they're in unstored calculations, it's kind of hard to tell, but
Right.
All signs point to yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. But yeah, I would like to confirm that.
Yeah, the magic 8 ball says yes. No, that we've poked at this solution a lot,
Right.
trying to analyze where exactly the performance hits are occurring, and to the best of our ability, the smoking gun is because these are not simple execute SQLs. It's not select uh, dollar amount from invoice table. They're complex SQL joins. And yeah, they're if you've got, it's one thing for the records to be created and they're having to be calculated, but those calculations are being triggered elsewhere too. And it's hard to track down exactly when. The top calls log helps a bit. We can analyze the top calls log and see where the find operator is occurring in conjunction with specific table occurrence and field names. And so we can see in the top calls log that some of these SQL calculated fields are definitely showing up as very lengthy entries in the top calls log when that server is getting bogged down. So those are the areas that we've been focusing attention for.
And that's a good point, John. I think I've definitely found that if my SQL query has more than one join in it, that any performance gains that I get from using that SQL call start to quickly evaporate.
That's interesting because part of when I say I love SQL and I'm so amazed by how fast it is, I never use joins because like the speed benefits even with a single join, at least in my experience, is I'll just create relationships instead.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, I limit to one join. If I need another join, then it's like, nope, we're not doing this. We're going back to native relationships.
Mm.
Yeah, I like SQL too, especially its ability to help you limit the complexity of the relationship graph. I do think that's a handy, instead of having to have, like, if you have a preferences table, instead of having to have a relationship back to it from every single table, being able to grab a preference value with a quick SQL call is it's pretty handy to prevent a lot of junk on the graph.
Yeah, that was certainly when we first had it, that was, one of the main saving graces, one of the things that was, trumpeted, and everybody was, it became very fashionable to clean up your graph. Like, look, I got this, 100 table occurrence graph down to 5 table occurrences because it's all using SQL.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any performance advantages like regarding an external data source? So say you have a multi-app, multi-file solution, and you only maybe have one situation where you need to access that external data source. Is it better to have it on the graph for that one time that you're going to pull it, or would it be better to refactor that with execute SQL?
Honestly, don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure I've ever tried using execute SQL with an external data source.
The only time I've done it is on when the external data source isn't a SQL table. It's pretty dang quick. But yeah, I can't think of any time where you'd want to use
And
that
I think
scenario.
I'm trying to think this through in my head. You can't use execute SQL as a function without having the other FileMaker database on the graph as in that solution as an external data source.
Right.
If you want to
Right.
prevent
Yeah.
the need to have that, you could, but you'd have to use FileMaker's ODBC commands for connecting to connecting to an external ODBC source, and I don't see why you couldn't do that. But then you're introducing an externality and having to maintain, if it's a Mac, you've got to get a third-party ODBC client. If it's Windows, you've got to configure the ODBC DSN. So I'm guessing that you would find it more convenient to add the FileMaker file as an external data source and do it that way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You need a table occurrence on the graph in order to call execute SQL.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing more of is a shift from execute SQL to using the FileMaker data API within itself.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up a minute ago that a lot of times now you have to evaluate which would you prefer, the execute data API command or the execute SQL function, because they both do somewhat similar things. And off the top of my head, I don't know if the execute data API function has, or it's not a function, it's a command, right? It's a function or a command? I think it's a command.
The command.
Yeah, so I don't think it has the same limitation with regard or performance. I don't think it has the same thing you have to be aware of as execute SQL about open records causing all the clients to be brought data side, because I think execute data API, doesn't it execute on the client side regardless? I don't know for sure the answer to that question.
My gut agrees with you.
Yeah.
Well, I would think since the result is that it pulls JSON, that it wouldn't matter if the record is locked or not. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, Claude says it runs on the server. On the other hand,
Makes sense.
it runs in FileMaker if you don't have server. So
Right. Yeah, that was my hang up. I know it runs by default, it's designed to run on the server, but you can run it on a local file and have it query itself.
yeah.
So there is a use case scenario. It's, unknown.
Yeah, we don't work on very many solutions locally, so
Right.
interesting. But yeah, I imagine people are using execute data API more and more and more versus execute SQL as JSON becomes more and more popular. I used it doing some testing to see if you could add records to a table any faster with execute data API versus, because we were troubleshooting a solution that there's a lot going on when you add a record to a table, and so it was a little bit slow when you were adding new line items to an interface that had line items on it. And I was curious if you could somehow sneak around the backside and add records faster with execute data API, but it didn't, at least in that case, it didn't make a difference.
I think there's a lot of nuances that go into that.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd ever be able to say definitively one's faster than the other. It's very use case dependent.
Yeah.
And table, like how many calculations are on that table versus how many things are related back to that table.
Right.
There's a lot going on there.
I'm very sure the fundamental problem there is the table is way too wide, way too many fields, a bunch of which are calculated. And no matter how you add records to it, you have a performance hit because of that. And no sneaking around the backside is gonna going to help.
And I just encountered something similar where I'm trying to import tens of thousands of records, and there's a lot of calculated fields. And if I import with auto enter options turned on for all of those, it's significantly slower than with the auto enters turned off. So what I've actually ended up doing is taking all of that data and pre-processing it all with Python in order to calculate the values that FileMaker would calculate, in the auto enters, and then just importing it with auto enter turned off.
That's interesting. I've often wished for a script step that lets you turn on and off auto enters in code, so that you could do various things. In particular, you periodically want to do some kind of data updates that don't muck around with the creation and modification timestamps. And I'd love to be able to say for a given table, turn all the auto enters off.
Mm.
You can do that with transactions. When you open up a transaction and you commit a transaction, you have the option to turn off the auto enters.
Doesn't replace field content support that now too?
It does, but only if you do it in code. It doesn't if you do it in the UI, you can't disable it. But yeah, you're right. In code, you can override that, which is, I think, the correct way they did that. You wouldn't want the random user to be able to do replace field contents in the user interface and override the auto enter stuff.
What is, just to shed some light on the positive sides of ExecuteSQL, where is anybody relying on ExecuteSQL on a regular basis for certain tasks?
I don't know if I'd say relying, but I use it quite frequently. Especially when a perfect example. So in this one system that we're building out right now, there might be like a multi-step process to go all the way from production to purchase and shipping. And you might have a sales order number that's trickling down from the initial sales order through production into the warehouse and the shipping processes, and finally to those final shipping documents. There's no user-facing location in some of those later steps where you can query what that, or like try to look for one of those final things, like a shipping document by sales order number, because it's not surfaced anywhere. And what is actually behind the scenes is the UUID for the sales order, not the friendly, human recognizable number. But with a really quick SQL query, you can scan, I have this sales order number, turn it into a UUID for me, and then go search that UUID in that table and return to me back just the number. And that works really well.
I think queries where you have a primary key and you need that record, that's one of ExecuteSQL's great use cases, because you're not doing a join, you're not returning huge amounts of records. You're just trying to get one record from one table. It's pretty good at that.
Yeah.
We've used it a bunch in some solutions to populate virtual lists. If we're doing some complex reporting from multiple different tables, ExecuteSQL lets you get all that data into variables and then use that to run virtual list reporting. It's pretty handy for that sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say that's one of my favorite uses is that scenario, and then having it return or build a JSON variable based on the data that the SQL is returned. There are custom functions that build the JSON for. I don't know if anybody does that anymore, but that's kind of a handy tool to transform your SQL result into JSON and then do what you need to do with it.
Right.
Why wouldn't you just use the data API since it automatically delivers the JSON?
Because then I don't have to worry about creating a layout, putting a fields on it, and going through the backside of setting up that, which I don't mind. I mean, that's perfectly viable. But when you've got something already in place and just need it to work quickly in certain scenarios, the ExecuteSQL works really well for that.
Yeah, that's precisely the use case that I use.
Yeah.
I mean, using ExecuteSQL and abstract, having custom functions to abstract your field and table names, so you're not worried about changing
requirement
field names or table names. Gives you a lot of flexibility. That using the data API, it's okay. Well, now you need to make sure that not only do you have a layout set up, but you've got to have the fields on there, and you can't change the names of the layouts or the fields, or that breaks the API. Doing this pathway of having abstracted SQL queries and then having a custom function that then parses the returned results into JSON is a really powerful tool.
I think just emphasizing for everyone that it's up to you, Lon, or me, or whoever, when you're writing that execute SQL call, to think very carefully. Do I need this to run PSOS for performance reasons, or is it okay to run it on the client side? Because that's like it is a potential landmine that's not that easy to track down if you've got the use of execute SQL out there on the client side, especially on a new solution, and it's super fast when there's 100 test records in the solution, and then randomly drags to an absolute standstill a year from now when there's 100,000 records in the table, and there's once in a while an uncommitted record, and now you've got this intermittent slowdown, and it's hard to troubleshoot because it's intermittent, and so I think I like execute SQL a lot, but it puts a pretty decent burden on the developer to think about the long-term situation and make sure they do it in a way that makes sense in the long run.
Yeah, if you run a SQL query and want to return a field that's set up as a SQL query and execute SQL, your server will explode.
Yeah. We have this one solution that sort of led to this DevCast topic that's almost literally the problem there. We're working hard to refactor it to get rid of the problem, but something like what you described is what happens there on a regular basis, and the server does practically explode. We have I don't know how many FileMaker servers out there with solutions on them that we support, hundreds maybe. I don't know exactly how many. And we have one that has this problem. I keep harping on the fact that we have all these FileMaker servers out there that run fine, and we have this one that has problems, and we have all these solutions out there with no execute SQL in field definitions, and then we have this one. It's a good object lesson for us all.
Yeah.
So I guess we should talk for a second about what are we doing to fix the problem.
Good point.
We've identified the problem. What are we doing to fix it? I think how do you deal with performance problems in software systems, database systems generally? A lot of the solutions involve time shifting when the calculations are occurring. And that's effectively what we're doing here. I should let Evan talk about it since he's doing most of the work there.
Yeah, so a lot of it is we are statically storing things now. So a lot of the fields are converted to just static text or number, depending on what was needed. And we are, instead of using SQL, we're using a utility window and going to the table specifically where the data is stored and finding it that way, because some of these were more complex joins, right, with the subqueries or passing a SQL query as an argument to a SQL query that is passed to another SQL query. We're just running to the tables directly and grabbing the data we need off of those. And that's an order of magnitude faster. Some of those SQL queries, as they were taking 30 seconds per record. And I got that down over a remote connection to about 5 seconds without much thought to it, honestly. So just the initial phase was a huge improvement on that. So that's the way most of it's going, is just getting away from SQL, at least the more complex SQL joins that I find, or SQL calls that I find, and storing it statically as I can.
Yeah. I think using script triggers or scheduled scripts at night to do the calculations instead of having the field calculations do it gives us control over when those calculations are occurring rather than the FileMaker database engine, which is, for stuff like that, that's the way it should be. We as developers should decide that and not leave it up to a random decision by FileMaker server.
Yeah, in this case, so far it's all script triggers. There's nothing scheduled or overnight syncs or anything like that. But yeah, in other instances, that's exactly what you would need.
Yeah, I know we've done it. I mean, I feel like overnight scripts are nice. They have no performance impact on the users. And if you can ask the question, do you need this value to be accurate to the minute, or is it okay if this field has a value that was accurate as of last night? If the answer is that last night's fine, then a scheduled script gets rid of the calculation from happening during the day at all. Um, eliminates any performance impact on the end users. Granted that a lot of times you need the data real time and you can't do it that way, but sometimes that works.
So to go off of Joe's, what are good uses of SQL? I'm interested. I am interested. Are any of you guys using SQL for schema related tasks? Like for instance, this one example that we keep talking about bad SQL usage actually is using it in a cool way too with global variables, where in case other devs don't know, when you take a file off of a hosted platform and edit it locally, you can have stored global variable or stored global fields when you go to rehost it if you don't get those cleared out. And in this solution, they are using SQL to identify global fields and then loop over them to clear everything out before you rehost the solution, which I thought was a nifty way of just uh, covering your own butt when you're doing
Yeah.
offline development for something. But are any of you guys using SQL for something like that, or schema editing, creating tables, fields, anything like that?
I I did one of the smaller bits of actual coding I've done in the last bunch of years. I did a blog post that's still on our website for a universal export dump uh, utility, and um, it uses those metadata tables to loop through all of the tables and all of the fields in a solution and export all the data to text files. So you can import those scripts into your solution, run them, and it'll do a full data dump to a set of files. Um, I think I wrote that. I think we had somebody contact us a long time ago, and I forget why, but for some reason they wanted a complete export of all data from all tables in their solution, and that's a fairly simple thing to write with those metadata tables that are available that have all the base table names and field names in them. That sample file is still on our website in the blog posts area.
To sum it up, don't put execute SQL in unstored field calculations.
I think that's a very good rule of thumb.
Or hide conditions.
Or hide.
Or hide conditions. Anything that's going to evaluate regularly.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably
That's
not
good.
conditional formatting.
Or
Yeah.
or tooltips probably.
Oh my God.
Well, that seems like a good point to wind up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for spending your time with us at the FileMaker DevCast today. We hope you found something useful, something thought-provoking, and something to take into your own development approach. Things to help you be more productive and to allow you and your teams to get more done in less time. You can find us online at portagebay.com and filemakerdevcast.com. Also, follow us on our social media accounts at Portage Bay or at FMDevCast. Please let us know if we can help you or your company with modernizing your approaches and streamlining your workflow. We look forward to seeing you during the next DevCast.